often people have discussions and they talk, and you've got difficult people and you've got non-difficult people, and between them they might end up with some really constructive stuff.
Welcome to the JvR Academy podcast. In this episode, we speak to Rob Warman, the senior facilitator at JvR Academy, who facilitates courses on emotional intelligence, stress management, conflict management, diversity, and leadership development training. Enjoy.
Welcome to this episode. So you do a lot of training for JvR Academy, and you do workshops on dealing with difficult people. How does that normally go?
Okay, well, let me start by saying that many of the workshops that we do training in cover skills that would help you deal with difficult people. So it's not often that we have a standalone that says, right, dealing with difficult people, here's a program. So I'm going to kind of pull on many of the skills and things that we do in our various programs, be it from conflict handling to facilitation skills to emotional intelligence, etc.
Okay.
Yeah, I think maybe the starting point is that I think one always has to look inside oneself to say, am I part of the problem? Am I labeling the other person? Because very often we can end up in this self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the one element as well. I think probably the most important thing in dealing with difficult people, if I need to answer that one, would probably be to be more receptive than to be expressive.
Okay.
And some of the communication skills that we deal with relate to the listening ability rather than trying to push. And we've got the push-pull strategy as well, and I think it's Richard Baker, who explains the push and the pull strategy. And I think dealing with difficult people, it's probably always best to go the pull strategy.
So does that mean that your approach isn't to speak more, but it's to listen more?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. Stephen Covey, says that we should seek to understand before we can be understood.
Okay.
And I think that kind of sums it up, that the more we can be receptive to where other people are coming from, that's when you can start to influence them. Because remember that if somebody's a difficult person, if we can use that label, if you like, you need to be able to calm the situation down and to be able to listen, because once you know where they're coming from, then you can start tackling their issues perhaps and your issues from a slightly different angle.
Okay, so do I understand correctly if you say your starting point in dealing with a difficult person is to first understand why they are being difficult? From your perspective is that they are being difficult. Your first question is why? There must be a logical reason for them to be acting this way.
Yeah, not always a logical reason, but okay. I think the moment you pick up that somebody is pushing back or somebody is coming up with some difficult issues or problems or problem statements or whatever the case might be, I think in pausing and just being able to listen, and I think together with listening goes the questioning ability, because you need to tease out the information perhaps. But you can't always do that. You can't always get the information from them directly, because it might be an unconscious thing. It might be seeking for recognition or whatever. So always to, I think, bear in mind that there's something happening for the other person which may be causing them to be coming across in a difficult manner. Okay. And I think the other thing that needs to be said is that people may not be consistently difficult. They might be difficult in a particular situation rather than being difficult people all their lives.
Okay.
So I think that's really the issue. If you're dealing with somebody who's constantly a difficult person, it's very difficult because they've obviously got issues that they're dealing with, and
yes.
Sometimes you do what you can. But I think the important thing is that as long as you know what you want out of that discussion, and as long as you drive that in a ethical way and in an assertive way versus an aggressive way, that would probably be a good strategy.
Talk to me. So I understand. I like that what you're saying there is to know what you want first, because it's very easy to get sidetracked with forgetting what your intention was. How does your intention or your expectations of the other person's behavior influence the situation? I mean, I often hear people very quickly decide, oh, that person's a narcissist.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, okay, that's quite harsh.
Hofmeyr, I think the difficulty is, how do I put this? Let me just give this some thought.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes through in, for example, if you read Crucial Conversations, is to create mutual gain. So it's also about what they want and what I want. It's not just about the one or the other. And I think that's possibly where some of the conflict handling styles come in. But I think a very important, maybe two important skills in your question would be the ability to empathize with the other person. Where are they coming from? To be able to acknowledge that and to be able to say, okay, I may or may not agree with you, but I acknowledge that this is where you're coming from. Okay. I acknowledge your emotion. I acknowledge your viewpoint. And I mean, the moment that you can acknowledge and empathize in that sort of manner, empathy is a great skill because it reduces tension and it builds trust in the relationship. And I think with a difficult person, if you've got trust or you are building trust in that relationship, then it makes it a bit easier to influence the other person.
Okay.
The other person doesn't see you as being driving your own agenda alone, but their stuff is also important. So the empathy skill is very important. And I think the other thing that I've learnt over the years is that to try and stay in dialogue.
Okay.
To not become defensive, to not become quick to push back.
Okay. So what does dialogue mean?
Dialogue is really about, in a non-judgmental way, being able to just allow people to talk and to give them the space where they can express themselves. And that happens when there's no judgment. It happens when there is keen listening from the other side. Doesn't mean that you must just be quiet. I mean, the listening ability is something that it's a two-way street. And we talk about active listening, which means being able to hear where the other person's coming from, being able to paraphrase back the key elements of what you've heard, and then also being able to describe your own thoughts and views and feelings and needs and wants. So for me, dialogue is about being able to create that safe space where two parties or more can just hear each other. And again, in the Crucial Conversations terminology, they talk about creating a pool of knowledge, pool of understanding, a common pool of understanding. And I think that's quite powerful, because once we've grown that pool of understanding and that common pool of knowledge, then we can start looking at ways to try and come to an agreement that meets everybody's needs.
Okay. That is very difficult when you're under time pressure.
Yes.
How do you manage? Is there any practical way to kind of find a balance when you're under time pressure?
It's when you're under time pressure, as well as pressure of hearing things that you don't necessarily want to hear. So I think practically one has to fall back on the emotional intelligence element of our skill set, if you like. And one of the most powerful things that I always remember is the Viktor Frankl quotation. And I've shared it with you before, and you might remember it. But he says that between stimulus and response, there's that space. And in the space, we have the power to choose our response. And in the response we choose lies our freedom and our growth. And it's very, very powerful, that, because practically by stopping yourself from reacting, counting to 10 or counting to 5 even, just slows down that whole process and allows you to then say, okay, so what is my response going to be? My initial response may be wanting to react and to defend or even to counterattack. And yet, by just sitting back and being able to hear, and if you pick up an emotion on the other side, the ability to just say, okay, I understand that you're angry, or I can see that you're frustrated by this. And that is so powerful. I'm not sure if I've answered that question. We sort of went around a bit.
No, it's cool. One thing that I think is sometimes difficult, personally I find this difficult, is your own need for feeling acknowledged and feeling heard. You know, when you're in a conversation with someone, and good to say, okay, I'm hearing this from you and I'm hearing that from you, but sometimes you don't get that back from the other person and they're just not getting your point.
Yes, yes.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I think practically, if one were to be experiencing that, let's look at it. What's happening inside oneself? I think the element of awareness is important, because what's going on inside you is probably you saying to yourself, you know what, I've given this other person a fair chance to explain their viewpoint and their wants and their needs. I've acknowledged it. I've really listened. I understand where they're coming from. But every time I try and push my agenda, if I can use the word push my agenda, or present my agenda, then I'm not getting the same respect, if you like. And so once you become aware of that, I think the important thing to be able to do is to use a tool like maybe the awareness wheel, where you can say something like, you know, John, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I can see that this is a very important issue for you. My problem, though, is that when I try to give you my viewpoint, I don't feel that I'm being heard. And I really want to be able to express what is going on for me, so that we can find a solution to the problem. So it's a matter of being honest about what's going on inside of you and what you want. Because often we might make a complaint to the other person, but they don't really know what you actually are wanting. So to be able to express that, and do it in a way that is respectful, you know, I think is good. And then hopefully that person is going to understand that you've given them chance. Now he must or she must give you a chance. I think the other point about that is that dealing with difficult people, one should try and stay with I language rather than you language. Because if it's always about, you know, you expressing something like you are disrespectful, etc., it immediately puts the other person on the defensive. So rather to say, this is how I see it, this is how I feel, this is my interpretation of what I'm seeing, please tell me if I'm wrong, or if I'm, you know, if there's value in what I'm saying. And I think using the I language helps you to take responsibility for your thoughts, your feelings, etc.
I like what you're saying about I language and you language. And that's something that's very easy to implement and might have quite an impact on how people perceive you. So how do you know, with that in mind, how do you know whether you are the problem? You might be the difficult person. What are some signs that might give you an indication?
It's not an easy one to answer, because, you know, there's a saying that says it's difficult to read the label of a bottle when you're inside. So we don't always know that we are the problem. And those of us who have that self-awareness, and there's many people who do that, probably are far better at knowing that they might be part of the problem. But I guess one of the signs would probably be that you may not be making any headway. You may be picking up constant resistance. You may hear very short and abrupt responses. There's, you know, in other words, you kind of may see yourselves moving out of dialogue, and there's probably a shutting down of communication.
Okay.
So things might get quieter. You may start having somebody on the other side of the table who is what you call perhaps a low reactor. And dealing with low reactors is quite difficult, because you don't know what's going on. And, you know, when we talk about negotiation skills, for example, we talk about the ability of successful negotiators to be able to express what's going on inside them, be it their rationale, their reasoning, their emotions, their viewpoints, etc. So that's a very powerful thing to be able to do when you're dealing with a low reactor, is to be able to express what's going on inside you. So yeah, I think many of us may be part of the problem, and when that happens, we need to then be able to step back and say, okay, so taking a helicopter view, if I were to sort of jump out of this discussion and almost hover from the ceiling to look down to see what's going on, what is it that I would be seeing? and then to get back in to the discussion and maybe try something new. So that something new might be, for example, getting into a question, getting into the listening mode, maybe summarizing, concluding, So, for example, I might say, okay, so John, if I'm hearing you correctly, are you saying the following, A, B, C, D, and you are wanting the following? That just helps to slow the discussion down a little bit, brings a bit more perspective to it. But I think, one of the things that often goes wrong in those kind of discussions, Hofmeyr, is that often people have discussions and they talk. And you've got difficult people and you've got non-difficult people, and between them, they might end up with some really constructive stuff. But one of the problems is that we tend to not want to close off things tightly. And what happens is that we then find that we haven't got an action plan, we don't know who's accountable for what, and a week later we find that things haven't happened, things haven't changed, things haven't been implemented. And it's not because people didn't want to do it, it's just because we didn't have clarity on what the next steps were. So part of your concluding skill is not only summarizing, but it's also having a future action that we can put in place.
Okay. It almost sounds like, there might be a time, if you yourself aren't very self-aware and you tend to be shutting other people down, that you might actually end up getting your way more often. But then maybe the performance starts lagging over time.
Yeah. And I think what you're touching on now is probably, certainly links back to assertiveness and the conflict handling style of competing. Now, if you are constantly going to be competing with others, you will win most of the time, because you come across perhaps in a forceful, domineering way. You might intimidate others, especially if you're a manager or a supervisor. And the problem with that is that although you might get what you want, the other party perceives that it's a lose situation for them. And whenever there's a win-lose situation, ultimately it ends up in a lose-lose situation.
Okay.
Because there's resentment, there is a feeling of I haven't got what I needed to get. There may even be feelings of manipulation. And the problem is that you have taken away from the relationship. And we mustn't underestimate the importance of building relationships and maintaining relationships, because to get a result from a relationship that is really poor, it's unlikely. And if you do get a result from a relationship that is not healthy, it'll probably be a short-term, non-sustainable result. You might drive a solution or a result, but there's no commitment to it, and that's a key element.
Interesting, the use of the word result makes me think of locus of control, and results are typically not fully within your control. So maybe this is a bit fuzzy, but if you are part of a team, working in a team, then it's kind of by definition that not everything is up to you, and you'd need to prioritize relationship building. I'm saying this because this is often the thing that we neglect first. When we start being outcomes driven and task driven and stuff like that, it's like it's very easy to start pointing the finger to others and saying, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. Why aren't you? You're a bad person. Where in fact, it sounds like what you're saying is start with building relationships first. Otherwise, the relationship constrains your ability to perform the task.
No, I believe so. If you've got strong relationships with your team colleagues, your team members, your ability to drive the right agenda is probably far better. The ability to influence others is far better. Remember that one of the elements of influence is likability. Now, we're not saying that you have to go around every day making people like you. But it has been shown that if you do things for others, if there's that element of reciprocity, or you do something for somebody else, it does affect the ability you have to influence them. And likability, if people just don't like you, how do you influence them? It's very, very difficult. So get the basics in place. Treat people with respect, with courtesy. irrespective of where they're coming from. We know that, but we don't always do that. If you've got that sort of basis, then you can start finding common ground in a team. I think the other point that's important is that one has to be flexible. You can't drive your own stuff all the time because that just is not reality. And I think people who are very results orientated may end up doing that. And then, of course, we have the problem of the relationships being damaged, people not buying into the solution, resenting the particular style of the other person. So being able to sit back and say, you know what, there are times when I'm going to accommodate somebody else. It's not on important issues. On important issues, I may not accommodate. I may rather drive a little bit stronger on those issues that are important for me. But things that are important for the other person and maybe not that critical for me, I can give in a little bit. Maybe I can compromise. But I think one of the things that we don't do enough, and bringing it back to difficult conversations and difficult people, is that we tend not to collaborate sufficiently. Now, again, there's a danger there because the more you collaborate, the more time you require to discuss. But in true collaboration, that's where you find the ability to make the pie bigger than just to spread the pie evenly like in a compromise. And as adults, we tend, in many cases, not to actually want to, or not to collaborate. And what happens is we stick in our own positions, we stick in our own demands. But those demands are being demanded because there's a particular need behind it, and we don't explore those needs. And if we were able to do that, then we would be able to find more common ground, or we could create more mutual gain for both parties. Okay. And to do that, one of the critical things to do is really to ask questions and to get information from other parties. Why are you saying that? What is it that will cause to happen? And it's very powerful. But again, it's difficult because when you've got your position, you actually want to drive. And so it's about pushing rather than pulling.
Okay. So questions help you to pull, and statements is you pushing an agenda.
Yeah, and I think it depends on how you put those statements forward. Even in a pulling strategy, you may still need to give your statements. You may need to still express yourself and describe. But I think if you're doing it in a forceful way, if you're doing it with a loud voice, then it starts to be seen as a push strategy rather than a pull strategy.
Maybe just shortly, some of the stuff that's typically very scary is sometimes very easy to gloss over conflict. You don't want to go into conflict. You don't want to highlight certain issues that's bugging you, and it kind of builds up, and you start building this picture of the person as a bad person.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
The way that I would answer that is probably to look back to the concept called the ladder of inference. It was designed by Chris Argyris and mentioned by Peter Senge in The Fifth Disciple. But I find that quite useful because it also links to one of the concepts in Crucial Conversations where they talk about mastering your story, managing your story. And I think that happens to all of us, is we hear things and we see things through a filter. And those filters are so often where our biases and our prejudices and our past experiences, etc., all lie. So to see somebody on the other side of the table and we start creating stories in our minds about what this person may be thinking, feeling, wanting, how they feel about me. And so before you know it, you've climbed up that ladder where the observable facts at the bottom, you've allocated a whole bunch of reasons and conclusions at the top of the ladder. And being at the top of the ladder just, is probably something where you have allowed your own prejudices and biases and your own stories to take you completely away from the actual truth of the matter. So to manage that, again, I would argue that the awareness wheel is a lovely tool to help you to manage that ladder of inference. So, for example, I might say something like, what I'm hearing you saying, or I'm sensing that you feel so strongly about this point, and I'm thinking that you totally disagree with my point, and I feel uncomfortable if we can't talk about it, and I really want to find out how you feel about it. So what you've done in that situation is you have tested your understanding or your interpretation, and your interpretation may be quite wrong. And so that person might then say, no, that's not really the way I'm thinking or feeling. This is how, and so you get that mutual clarity, or you get more clarity.
It's interesting. It's now that you mentioned this, it almost sounds like everyone's on the Agile bandwagon at the moment, and it's all about how do we shorten and increase feedback loops.
Yes.
And you can almost start talking about Agile conversations actually.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like that's what you are describing, is making a statement or saying something, asking for feedback, making a statement, asking for feedback. And whilst it goes slower, communication is more accurate. You're more on target. Yeah, it's just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's a good point. Definitely does do that. It creates that mutual understanding. I was just trying to think of something that we did, negotiations, that relates to what you're saying, or influencing skills, where certain salespeople were told you need to get in there, get the result, and walk away because time is money. And the other group of people were told that you need to engage in a little bit of chit-chat first and, build the relationship before you. And the amount of sales that were achieved through the second approach were phenomenally higher than the first approach. So being able to build the relationships, but also to share that information in that agile way that you're talking about.
Oh, that's cool. Last question. Everyone's talking about innovation, and typically we've got the stereotypical view of an innovator being a kind of maverick that comes in and rocks the boat. It's all great to be hiring innovative people until they start wanting to change things, and then the system or the bureaucracy sort of rejects them out back into the job market. When it comes to creative ideas and with innovators, I can imagine it's very easy to start labeling them as difficult people. How do you work with them, with these kinds of principles that you're talking about?
It's very interesting. But I guess if I think aloud, innovators do create problems for us as, let's say, if we are non-innovators, in that it implies that we're going to have to change. And that sort of change might require financial resources, changes in systems and processes and people, etc. And so immediately we might reject ideas. And I think that is dangerous, because then you start to stifle that creativity and that innovation. Having said that, we also need to acknowledge that people in the organization who are not innovators, or not in that sort of label, if you like, may still have the right approach. So just because somebody's an innovator doesn't necessarily mean that they are right. They've got wonderful ideas and they've got great sort of innovative thinking, etc. But it doesn't always mean that they're right. So I think it's a double-edged sword. I think one needs to listen to the innovations and objectively apply your mind to, wow, that's a good thought, that's a good idea. I wonder if we can't implement it. But on the other side, we also need to say, the innovator who comes into my organization, surely I still have to have some boundaries that I impose on that person. When I say impose, I'm not talking about in a dominating way, but I'm saying in an assertive way, where you can hear, you can listen, you can acknowledge the ideas, you can recognize those ideas, and then you might say, well, it's great, maybe later on in the year we can look at something like that. The moment it's going to be a bit difficult, so you still need to drive certain boundaries. But I think the other thing is that if you are engaging with an innovator and you find that there are great ideas coming, but they're not quite well thought through, or they haven't sort of been thought through to implementation phase and so on, or there might even be latent problems in them, it doesn't stop you as a receiver of information to build onto those ideas. And the building skill is a very important one. Instead of rejecting something outright because you don't like one or two elements of it, rather try and build those elements into the suggestion to make it an implementable solution.
Okay, just Shortly on building, so what does that mean? Would it mean to say, I like this part of it, this part, can we focus
Absolutely,
on that? Or?
absolutely. So you often hear building behavior if you hear things like, I like what so-and-so is saying. I think that it may be missing this or that, and if we were to do this, then I think it could work.
Okay.
And it also means being honest. For example, I don't like that idea. So building doesn't mean that you're always going to take somebody else's idea and mold it into a usable. I mean, if it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea. But don't automatically just sort of judge it as being bad because it's different from what you might want to do.
Okay, and then final question, the use of the word but. We're talking about building and buts.
You know, Hofmeyr, this one I've never really got my hands around. I hear so many people saying we should never use the word but, you know. I just find it very difficult not to do that. And if you use other words like however, it's the same thing. And if you say something like, I like what you're suggesting, and it's not, you actually, I think you're lying to that person. You're not disagreeing with them. You're saying, I like what you're thinking, and I think if we were to do this, it would be better.
Okay.
For me, that's not a honest answer. So I don't have a problem saying, I like your thoughts. I like what you're saying about implementing this. I think there are a few gaps in what you're saying, and I'd like to suggest the following. But often I use the word but, and I think I don't think we must take that one too
far.
Too far, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks,
Rob. But many people would disagree with me on that one.
Yeah, I'm sure, but it's great to bring that perspective in, just to bring a bit of balance back, because you're right. It's very easy to make a blanket statement and say never use this word ever again.
Yeah.
And throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
And I think what happens is that after you've used the word but, what comes after that is what's going to help to contain, and manage and maintain the relationship, etc.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thanks for having me, and I've enjoyed chatting with you, Hofmeyr.
Excellent. Thanks.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our Ukwanda podcast. We would love to open up the floor to you. If you would love to share some of your own insights, please email Hofmeyr at hofmeyr@jvrafrica.co.za. Thank you.